Well, good afternoon, and thank you once again for joining us. We've got an incredible panel of speakers with us today, and we're going to be exploring a bit of a controversial topic: the pushback against green energy transition. Today, we're going to be talking about everything from carbon border changes to packaging bans, political rollbacks that are all colliding with business plans, and talking about who is going to be funding the energy transition and where is this money coming from. Zöe, as the global head of research of sustainability and integration at HSBC, you see these flows firsthand. Now, we know the energy transition needs roughly about $6 trillion every year, but there is a $2 trillion gap. Where is that capital most likely to come from over the next 12 months?
Well, first off, Katie, thank you, and thank you to the World Green Economy Summit for inviting me to speak today, because, of course, the most important topic is who is going to pay for this transition. And we have to get a bit more innovative in our thinking around this topic. We know today that the public sector is fully exposed to debt. We've got up to 100 trillion of debt outstanding in both emerging and developed markets. So we do have to look to wider sources, and one of those sources has to be the oil and gas industry as a whole and the fossil fuel sector that is in transition itself. But first, one of the areas that has been particularly successful in terms of mobilizing capital is the fixed income labeled product space. So green bonds today are outstanding at 2.7 trillion. And that's a green bond is one where the use of proceeds is very clearly defined for green projects, so we're financing the transition through that route. But if you widen that out to the sustainability lens, you get another 2.1 trillion of bonds outstanding, taking it, of course, to 4.8 trillion outstanding as we stand today. Now, we know that's not enough. You mentioned a 2.2 trillion gap. So if we take a look at the oil and gas sector as a whole and look at how that capital is being deployed within companies themselves and also through the sovereign wealth fund network, we can immediately see that there's room for potential. And we expect that to become in a greater prominence in the year ahead and in the 5 to 10 to 15 years as we move forward to thinking about net zero to 2050.
Mm-hmm. And I think you make an interesting point there. We are seeing a number of big oil and gas companies, particularly in this part of the world, really play their part in that active transition as well. Jaison, let me bring you in here, because as a partner at Avia & Co, you are in the boardroom when a lot of these big decisions are being made. Now, I want to ask your thoughts on the EU carbon tax. As we know, that will start charging next year. So when CBAM actually starts charging, the IMF has warned that exporters of carbon-intensive goods, things like steel, cement, and aluminium, are likely to face increases of more than 1% on shipments to Europe. So what do companies in this part of the world, here in the Gulf, what do they need to be doing now in order to prepare for that?
Thank you, Katie. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. That's a great question. When we look at CBAM is essentially a charge at the EU border on exporters into the EU on the carbon-intensive products, as you rightly mentioned, steel, aluminum, fertilizers, hydrogen, for that matter. In terms of how companies are preparing for it, I would say the first thing would be to know that it's going live in the next 3 months. So the first bit would be to know and map your carbon exposure. When it comes to the product that you're exporting into the Europe, to know what is your actual carbon footprint when you're looking at your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. That would be the first bit. The second bit would be to look at your own suppliers and contractors and contract strength. You would want to embed carbon and strong embedded carbon metrics into your contractors so that the suppliers are held captive to their responsibility in terms of their delivery. That would be the second bit. Third would be to have a scenario planning. When we look at the carbon charges, if you look at EU, right now it's roughly placed around 70 to 80 euros per ton. So it would be prudent for your financial department to look at your entire carbon footprint and have a scenario plan for, let's say, 70 euros, 80 euros, and we can even see leaders in the industries. For example, Microsoft is a great example where they have looked at $100 per ton. So that would be the scenario planning. Fourth would be to decarbonize quickly. When you look at your own operations, as you know, when you look at operations, it's roughly 11 times more, the carbon footprint is higher when it comes to your own strategic management. That's the third bit. And finally, I would say as a board, when we speak to boards, what we look at is having a structure in place, a place of accountability, have the companies, have the board, and have a champion. And back in the day, you would call it sustainability officers, but a champion who can quantify your carbon data across the board. So that would be the different ways in which we can, an organization can prepare for the CBAM.
Mm-hmm. So really, I think, I guess appreciating that climate risk is really linked to financial risk as well. Jessica, let me bring you in here, because as the CEO of Eco Business and the founder, you've been following climate policy for about 20 years. You're based in Singapore and you advise governments and corporates all over the world on what they need to understand about climate policy. So when we talk about things like CBAM, obviously for Asian exporters, we are looking at tighter margins. For buyers here in the Gulf, higher prices on core materials like steel and cement. From your view, how disruptive do you think these new charges will be, and what should Gulf companies be doing now in order to try and get ahead of it?
Thank you so much, Katie, for your question and also for the opportunity to be here. I remember the last time I was in Dubai was actually for COP28, where the international community agreed on the historic words to transition away from fossil fuel. So I'm really excited to have been following policy in the UAE and Middle East. We started a newsletter, and I really commend the leadership I've seen in this region. Now, we've been seeing a wave of regulation, and EU CBAM is one of them. We know it's been coming for years, and Asia, as the manufacturing hub of the world, we have been trying to get ready for that. And I think what companies have been doing really is that they have been investing in decarbonization, because what's happening really is the leveling of the cost of carbon and leveling of the playing field. And so even though there was actually a lot of pushback from a lot of different countries on CBAM, I think many countries accused the EU of playing trade tactics, etc. But if you take a step back, what it's actually trying to do is putting a price on carbon. And for many, many decades, we have operated on the principle of the invisible hand of the market, Adam Smith, and look at where it's got us, right? We are seeing the accelerating climate crisis, we're seeing deepening inequalities, and we have to make the market mechanisms work for us. Mm-hmm. So what we've been seeing in Asia is that the companies that have been preparing for this legislation, decarbonizing their industries, innovating, and really, getting ahead of the game, have actually won market share and got the competitive advantage. And if I can also bring in, another EU legislation, the EUDR, that's also one of the pieces of legislation that's heavily impacting Asian countries, Gulf companies. And the result is that you have to get your own house in order, you have to know how to disclose, you have to know how to measure, how to account for it, and this all puts us in a much better competitive advantage. So I think the companies that have invested and have prepared are in a very good position, and the companies who are lagging behind are those that think things are not going to move at the speed that it's going to move because of the chaos we've seen this year. But I think that would be quite foolish if that was the approach they took.
And you say that really private sector companies should not be waiting for regulators to enforce the rules, that really they need to be preparing now before it's too late.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell me a little bit more about that. Do you think the private sector is open to that kind of advice, or do you think most of us tend to wait until the actual rules are in place? Bit of carrot versus stick.
There's a whole wave of companies that see this as an opportunity rather than a compliance issue. And apart from the wave of regulation around trade and around manufacturing rules, etc., we are also seeing a wave of disclosure mandates. In Asia, where I sit, there are net zero targets, there are disclosures that are now aligning to the IFRS S1 and S2. Banks and companies, listed companies, are meant to disclose their climate risk. And in fact, even non-listed companies in Singapore, if you're above $1 billion revenue, you have to disclose disclose, whether you're listed or not. And so I think private companies see this coming, and those that have an enlightened board and management, they know that they have to get, their companies prepared, they need to build the in-house capacity, they need to look at their strategy on how they can implement it. But there are varying levels of success for this, and we've seen in Asia as well that there are many companies that think that, they're pushing back against the regulation. They're saying this is too much, the compliance cost is too high, we're just surviving, why are you making us do this? But I think if we take the long-term view, what you said, climate risk is financial risk. If you don't take action today, you might be faced with a much larger bill in the future. And so I think with a lot of the companies that are looking at how do you plan, in the years ahead, they are actually sitting up to the fact that regulation is coming at them, and that's something that I think governments need to continue to enforce and to advance.
And we are seeing more pressure on disclosure. Zöe, it's something I want to ask you about a little bit later. But Mohamed, let me bring in you here, because the UAE is doing some incredible work. They're rolling out extended producer responsibility here, even as we see pushback in other parts of the world, from the US, UK, many parts of Europe as well. Now, we know packaging today makes up around 40% of all plastic waste, and yet less than 10% of plastic worldwide is actually being recycled. A lot of it ends up in landfill. A lot of it ends up being leaked into our environment. Tell me, from your role as the chairman of the Circular Packaging Association, what is the one incentive that would ultimately move the industry the fastest, and who should be carrying that cost?
Thank you, Katie, and thanks so much for having me today. I will take from Jessica's point, and I say private sector and companies is not afraid from accountability. What they are afraid of is uncertainty. So when policies are in place in a way that the companies are not able to predict what's happening next year or the year after, things will start to be questionable. From the EPR perspective and packaging, and thank you so much for sharing these statistics at the beginning, because packaging is linked to climate, believe it or not. Those waste elements of packaging, plastics, cardboards, and everything that is not getting recycled is either being exported, hopefully, or being actually ended up in landfill. Ending in landfill means creation of methane, which is way, way more harmful to the climate than lots of other gases, greenhouse gases. So it's a very, very strong linkage between packaging circularity and climate. Now back to your question, what is the one thing that will enable the industry and the companies to drive further innovation towards circularity of packaging? It's mainly the predictable, consistent, and flexible policy framework that the companies can excel their innovation and direct their investment towards it to make sure that they have a long-term plan that can address these policies. And this is exactly why the CPA was formed in the UAE, because there is a huge momentum here in the country of the public-private dialogue that can enable a policy framework that can enable these action plans. On the cost side, let's imagine what is circularity on packaging? It's simple. Today we drink the water bottle, and I'm preparing a plastic water bottle for this because glass usually is being tagged as circular and environmental friendly materials. But let's see this bottle. We drink, we throw, and then it goes to landfill. This is linear. Circular is simple. We drink, we throw, it goes into the economy again, recycled, and back to the game. So imagine with me, it's like a highway road, right? The government creates the road. The companies with the fees start to do the lining and the maintenance of the road. And the consumers are the riders, so the people. We are the riders. We either choose to ride carefully and actually have the right awareness to segregate waste at shores, to start acting responsibly for these materials and products, or we can drive recklessly and create accidents. So it's not only a cost dollars or dirhams element, it's more of a responsibility element that is shared all across the ecosystem of packaging circularity.
It's got to be that circular economy, doesn't it? Tell me, where do you see the biggest gaps in the frameworks today, Mohamed? You spoke there about the private sector really wanting that stable framework, that reliability. Where are the biggest issues today?
Again, back to the bottle. Okay. So it's nice because I just want you to familiarize yourself with it as a personal example. Let's assume this is the bottle that we want to recycle today. First is it's at home. I bought it. Do I have the right infrastructure at home that can enable me to segregate waste, And do I know where should I put this bottle and where should I put the other glass bottle? So this is the infrastructure and the awareness campaigns. Am I getting incentivized and penalized in case I am doing this or not? This is one. Then the right infrastructure for collection, and the policies related to collection. Then the right infrastructure for recycling, and the green financing and the investments and FDI attraction for recycling infrastructure that can enable this waste after we collect it to actually recycle it. And then finally, the policy that mandate the companies who are in the country to reuse this recycled outcome of these investments. So it's a cycle of policies that needs to be there. I will tell you, unfortunately today, we lack lots of harmonization on policies on this element when it comes to harmonizing these policies in one country and in one region to enable the scale. But there are lots of opportunities as well. That's why we are getting the momentum. Since COP28, I would say, there is a very, very strong momentum when it comes to circularity on packaging that we were able to work. And even before, but COP28 was the cherry on the cake. And now we are trying to drive these elements and address every gap to drive the circularity on packaging.
Jessica, I can see you want to comment on this.
Yes, we were arguing about this issue even before the panel started, but I have covered the Global Plastics Treaty for many years, and in fact, EcoBusiness, we just launched an impact documentary called Wasted. It's not about getting wasted, it's about the waste issue. And I think that the one thing that you asked was the one key thing. It's producers pay principles. And I think that that principle has not been taught often enough, because at the end of the day, we want that circular economy infrastructure, but in how many countries is it possible for you to actually, at the end of life of that plastic bottle, be able to put it into an infrastructure that actually recycles it into the economy? It's not there. And for decades, we've been waiting for the private sector to put that in, and it hasn't happened. And so now what we're seeing is that actually, with the Global Plastics Treaty not coming to a conclusion, every single country is still capable of putting in its own legislation. And it has to be on the basis of polluters pay, because it is the problem that they've created, and they have to contribute to the solutions and to the financing of those solutions. So I just want to make that point.
No, actually, allow me to small comment. I fully agree with you, because we were just waiting in these decades for the private sector to take a step. This is exactly the reflection of the cost question. We have three different elements of the ecosystem: the government, the private sector, and the people. So everyone should step up for their own responsibility. By the policies, I fully agree with you. By the private sector responsibilities, and as well the consumer awareness and the responsible, I would say, acts with consumption.
Okay, interesting. But yeah, Jessica, you obviously feel that we do need that regulation, we do need those potential penalties if we really want to see real change on the ground. Let's take a look at the bigger picture, Zöe. We were talking a little bit about the $2 trillion gap in funding in order to manage the green energy transition. So there is a shortfall, but at the same time, sustainable bond issuance worldwide, that topped $1 billion. So clearly capital is moving. Tell me, are we seeing tools like CBAM or circular economy mandates? Are they steering it in the right place across borders? What are the big opportunities, and what kind of investor appetite is there for something like the issuance of green bonds?
Well, let's start with CBAM, because we've touched on that a moment ago. So clearly, in terms of companies getting prepared to maintain their market share of a given product that is going to be subject to CBAM, means that they're making operational investment into making their own business future-proof to be able to participate in that market. And that creates a momentum around the operational sustainability factors that are, of course, helping everybody. But then there's the wider agenda, which is, if you're as an investor managing a fund that is thinking about how to both be aligned to climate outcomes, but manage the wealth of that fund for your clients and for future generations, then you also need to think more so today about the macroeconomic consequences of how CBAM will play out alongside the company-specific ones. And that's where we expect a lot of the work in terms of the financial sector markets research analysts to be focusing on. Now, why is that important? It's important because as we go through the cycle of nationally determined contributions, the country climate plans that we're seeing at the moment ahead of COP, they're giving very clear signposts to investors of what an economy needs to do and wants to do in terms of managing climate change. That can then give rise to the innovative financial instruments because there's more certainty around the plan. Investors can make a choice on whether they believe the plan will be delivered or not, but they can't complain that they didn't know the plan because it's set out in the NDC. And therefore, that can give rise to the public-private partnerships in a more comprehensive fashion than we have seen previously, bring in philanthropy, for example, give the MDBs, the concessional finance layer, again, a little bit more certainty and clarity, because to Mohamed's point, it's the certainty and clarity that is what investors like when they're thinking about innovation in finance.
And then the second part of the question, how much appetite is there for the issuance of green bonds today?
Yeah, well, so for example, here in the Middle East, the issuance is expected to reach between 18 and 23 billion in 2025. So, you know, investors are buying. And there's several reasons for that. Again, it's to do with the transparency of what the funds are going to be used for. It's a diversification exercise. So there are a whole variety of reasons of why market participants want to stay involved, particularly in this region.
Interesting point. Let's talk a little bit more about some of that uncertainty. Jaison, you were saying earlier that around a third of investors are still held back by policy uncertainty. Mohamed, is something you've raised as well. Now, Jaison, one solution you've written about is having internal carbon pricing. Not many boards here actually use it though, even though the IMF is calling for a $75 global carbon floor by 2030. Some firms are already pricing it at $50 to $100. Tell me, if you were advising a board tomorrow, where should they set it? And what are the biggest risks if they delay?
Thank you, Katie. I kind of agree with Mohamed and what Zöe was telling. In terms of ICP or the internal carbon pricing, essentially it's a voluntary price that an organization places on carbon. And the beauty of ICP is it can be both a micro and a macro tool. It's inward and outward facing. So essentially when an organization, to answer your first question in terms of where or what is the price that they should be placing, I would say if you're operating in EU, you would have to go by the CBAM numbers that is currently at 70 to 80 euros, roughly 75 to 85 US dollars. But otherwise, what we can see is organizations look at the stress testing the numbers from 50 to 120 US dollars. And we have leaders, for example, Unilever, Microsoft, placing it at $100. So the beauty about ICP is that it gives the company a stress test and an opportunity to look at their strategy, their operations, and their supply chain, to look at what are the exact quantifiable numbers when it comes to their carbon footprint. The second thing is we advise companies to look at their peers. There was a recent report out by Oxford University and Patch on the number of organizations doing and having an ICP, and that is transparently put out, right? And when we look at the report, we see about 1,700 companies across sectors, across services, across products, putting out their ICP transparently. So that gives us a sense check for organizations operating in similar geographies, similar sectors, to have that number. And the beauty about ICP is that, unlike ESG had a lot of qualitative indicators. Here it's quantifiable. You get to know what your operations are at, what's your carbon footprint across downstream and upstream. And the beauty is that ICP is also an indicator for policymakers. I understand this panel is about green pushback and the policies in the region, and it is a real-time test for the policymakers, because no longer they are coming up with scenarios with projected numbers. Essentially, they're looking at real numbers that organizations are placing what would institute a behavioral change, what would actually move a sector to behave responsibly. So the first thing would be to look at the geography that you're looking to operate at. Second would be to look at your peers. And finally, in terms of what are the risks when it comes to not having a price on your carbon footprint, would be it's a strategic risk, there is a financial risk, as most of the panel members agreed on, and there is an operational risk. And most importantly, there is a reputational risk as well when we're looking at Gen Z in terms of their employment aspirations. They want to be associated with brands that are more environmentally responsible or perceived. Mohamed was earlier on telling that his children do not want to be associated with plastics, but I think that's a key insight, right? It's not just financial risk, it's also reputational, and that's what is pushing the boards to consider a price on carbon, and ICP is an excellent tool, both inward, for both at a micro level and at a macro level.
So tell me, why do you think there is a hesitancy then? Is it purely financial, or does it go deeper than that?
Well, it's not just financial. I think I would go back to Mohamed's point. It's the lack of policy clarity. Mm-hmm. There should be policies. Believe it or not, companies who have an ICP want more policies, want more explanation from the government. And we are seated in UAE. UAE is one country that has carved a niche. It has been a traditional energy supplier, a trusted partner. But if you look at UAE's own power composition, 28% of UAE's power comes from renewable energy. And we are talking about CBAM. How many of us know that there is a climate law that has been mandated since May that requires every facility in the UAE that has over 500,000 metric tons to disclose it? And the real innovation is it is backed by blockchain technology. So we have a national carbon registry backed by blockchain technology. So I would say that there's a need for pragmatic policies, and we can see UAE is not a great example because UAE already has policies in place. But when we look at the wider region across Africa, Asia, what we need is policies that act as guardrails. So that would unlock finances from financial institutions on bankable projects.
And I think you make an interesting point there about having the right policy in place. Mohamed, let me bring in you here, because when we look at packaging rules across the Gulf, they're also quite fragmented as well. So it's difficult to create that stable environment. As we stand today, a bottle that is designed in Dubai may not be compliant in somewhere like Riyadh. Now, as the chair of the Circular Packaging Association, you've got 30 members across oil and gas, brands, brand owners, retailers, converters as well. Tell me, how do you think the UAE can take the lead when it comes to setting regional standards? And how do we ensure that we don't end up with leaders and a whole lot of red tape and bureaucracy slowing that process down?
A very important question. The UAE, I believe this is for a long time, not only on packaging, has taken the lead for several elements. And let me quote His Excellency Dr. Tanis Diudi when he talked earlier today about how CEPAs and trade agreements with different nations has a specific segment when they talk about trading of green products and environmental friendly trade, which is absolutely great because it's a push from different angles of how we can enable policies, frameworks. One of the things that also I wanted to applaud DIWA for, Dubai specifically has its own Dubai energy strategy. The people who were here in the city for a long time, they know about, or maybe they heard about Dubai Shams, which is a solar initiative from the DIWA and the Dubai government for companies and entities to transform their energy supply to solar energy. In 10 years, this industry became a $12 billion industry. Wow. So sometimes regulations could be the utopia that everyone loves. But sometimes, as you rightly mentioned, these could be red tapes right, left, and center, and then we are detangling, we don't know what should we do and how should we manage differences between two very close markets, or 3 or 4 or 5. So the way of the UAE leading through is great because of one, I would say, main element, which is enforcing a very, very strong public-private partnerships through several associations. CBA is one of them, but lots of the private-public dialogue in the UAE is really thought about carefully, and they're actually driving a very, very strong public sector policy creation after consultation of the private sector. On the other side, how can we avoid these red tapes and bureaucracy that can drive things through? I believe harmonization is the most important thing. Okay. We should always look at the lens of Dubai, the UAE, the GCC, the MENA region or the Arab region, and even Middle East and Africa, and even, like Jaison said, Asia and Africa in general, as we try to, as much as we can, to drive proximity, to ensure scale that can enable the right circularity. Mm-hmm. Today, if we are sitting in this room doing only circular packaging in this room, it will never work. Because there is no scale, we are very small. But again, if we can able to drive the scale and harmony as much as we can to drive the right value for everyone in the value chain, then it will be.
So then how do you have those conversations across borders? How do you actually implement that on a practical basis, not only here in Dubai or the UAE, but Qatar, Oman, Saudi Arabia, etc., and further across MENA?
So we more or less lobby with several organizations. So GSO is one of them, or GCC in general. So the GSO, the Gulf Standard Organization, which is part of the Gulf Council. We also have the League of Arab States, so across MENA. We're trying as much as we can to drive policies that are harmonized in nature, predictable in nature, as well as flexible in nature, to make sure that the industry can utilize these policies in a way that can fund the interest of innovation and drive harmonization. It's not easy, just to make sure that we are not sending the wrong message. It's very hard to drive this harmony all across UAE, GCC, or MENA region. But this is the one thing that we are mainly focused on, plus for sure a very predictable policy in each country, like what you mentioned, to make sure that we're driving into the right direction.
And it really does feel like there is very much that mood for change, a lot of that action that is happening in this part of the world. But if we look at the global picture, that's certainly not the case. We've certainly seen big pushbacks in new Washington administration, certainly in the UK and parts of Europe as well. Jessica, let me get your thoughts on this, because what does it mean for companies when we look at this fragmentation in terms of standards around the world as we're seeing this political pushback? How is that uneven landscape affecting companies? Are there any opportunities hidden in this resistance?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think, I don't want to make a political statement, but I think what's coming out of the US is quite irresponsible. I mean, if we look at, the accelerating climate crisis, it's one thing to ignore it, but worse, to aggravate it. And now we've seen, quite a fragmented landscape, as you've mentioned, and companies are scrambling to respond to that. And I think the number one harm that it's done to the world is that because of such a fractured landscape and CEOs are just sort of like trying to plan and there's no certainty, a lot of the strategy for long term then gets deprioritized, and you see a lot of companies then just grappling with so many different things, not just climate but then trade and then cybersecurity, AI, and there's just so many agendas that are competing for attention. But if you think about the long-term trajectory, I just want to share one statistic. Out of the $3 trillion invested into global energy capacity last year, 2/3 of that went into renewables. And I think that it's a really powerful statement, because sometimes you read the news and you get depressed and you get fatigued because you think, there's just so much bad news happening. But if you cut away the noise and you look at financial flows, right, where the money is flowing, it is flowing in the right direction. And why? Because it's economics. And it's really good business sense and it's good risk mitigation when you're investing for the transition and when you're looking at what are some of the commercial opportunities that have emerged. Look at what's happening with China. I mean, we've heard a lot of speakers over the last 2 days talk about the leadership that it's presented, and now, it's dominant in the EVs, wind, solar, and all our industries of the future, and EU is playing catch up, Asia is playing catch up, and the US still has their head in the sand. But, I think I was just talking to Zoe about the New York Action Climate Week that's just happened, and everyone going into it with low expectations, but then actually coming away feeling really energized, because what we're seeing now is then a pushback to the pushback. And there's this re-energizing movement of people saying, no, this is not the leadership that we want, and therefore this is what we should respond. And I think companies who are serving this landscape, the CEOs and the boards that are long-term, if they think for the long term, they will see that this is long-term value creation, and they shouldn't have, just a short-term lens, which was actually discussed in an earlier panel today. And I think that that's going to be something that's worth watching and quite exciting, frankly.
Now, you're based in Singapore. What are some of the opportunities that you're seeing there at the moment? Again, obviously big focus on Asia. So true, you mentioned yesterday we were speaking with Shanghai Electric as well about the incredible work they've done in the Mohammed bin Rashid solar park here. But from your perspective within Singapore, what are companies excited about when you're advising the governments, the big corporates? Where are you seeing those real green shoots of opportunity today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I just came back from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and I had the Deputy Prime Minister on my panel along with a colleague from HSBC, and he's also the Minister for Energy Transition. And in Asia right now, we are building what is called the ASEAN Power Grid, and it has, the aspirations of, imitating the Nordic power system where you can trade renewable energy or energy at any given day. And that requires trillions of dollars going into it, but that is also a massive opportunity. I think to Mohamed's point about harmonization, codes, and, just the influx of financing into renewable, facilities, as well as the data center boom that Asia is seeing, is just an incredible amount of commercial opportunity. The highest rate of EV growth is in Asia as well. A lot of electrification, battery storage, the hydrogen revolution is also happening. So there's just so much activity happening there. And I think that we need to be thinking about where we should be investing. And I think I really struggle when I go to conferences and I hear, sort of like the legacy companies saying, oh, no, we are still here and please invest in us. And actually, the economics just does not work out. Back to the money talks point I was making. So Asia is a very exciting place to be, and I would say the GCC region is extremely exciting as well, because the energy transition brings all sorts of opportunities. And let's not forget the human side of it as well, because I think there was a panel on the just energy transition talking about communities being left behind because they don't have the skills to participate. And I think that, responsible companies and governments need to think about how do you upskill the workforce, and how do you empower them with technology and AI and all these things that are at our doorstep right now, to enthuse them about what's coming. And I think that that's really exciting.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really interesting point there. I was speaking about climate justice yesterday, and I think we were saying the energy transition is going to be providing 20 million new jobs, but potentially displacing, I think it was 16 to 18 million jobs as well. Obviously, we've been speaking a lot about the pushback, the green pushback in US, UK, Europe, etc., some of these bigger, older Western nations and economies. But Jaison, I feel like there's also a real drive for change when it comes to the global south as well, some big opportunities there too. What have you seen behind the scenes with corporates?
Yes, just to give a set of context in terms of the need for the market, Africa requires about 2.8 trillion US dollars. I'm sure, Zöe, you can correct me, you are the data person on the panel, but about 2.8 trillion US dollars to decarbonize by 2050. And the amount of finances that flowed into Africa from 2000 to 2020 is just 41 billion. But if we were to just look at the voluntary carbon markets of Asia, they can generate up to 10 billion US dollars. So my argument would be that do we really need Washington or Brussels to dictate, or do we have to look at their playbook even? I think Global South has the potential, and it only has to be matched with ambition. And UAE has been a great example of that. When we look at the power competition and even channeling of resources, when you look at COP28, many of us mentioned COP28. COP28 is a great example of the consensus that was brought and the amount of finances that were channeled in. And when we look at the GCC has a unique lever, that is the Sovereign Wealth Fund. They can act as extension of the state and their ambition when it comes to climate. If you look at just the investment, there's more than $91 billion that's been invested on clean energy solution, just by 3 countries from the GCC. So if GCC and Asia and Africa can work together, and Africa is an untapped potential, just to give scale, when we look at the maximum amount of carbon trading, 44% still happens in Europe. Why is that? So these are questions that we must ponder about, and if we were to look at it, Global South can be leaders. They don't have to be followers. It's about, the first thing would be, when we look at carbon credits, we were talking about CBAM, how can we have interoperable policies and credits? For example, China just, they just gave out their national plan, right? And they had carbon credits included in that. But how interoperable is it? With China, with Malaysia, with Japan, Indonesia has their own exchange. So we have GCC, a consortium for oil and gas, but what about a carbon consortium? And that's the place where I think associations can play a huge role in disseminating the information and bringing in that consensus.
I'd love to hear some specific examples of whether it's the sectors or the companies that you're consulting with in this part of the world. What are some of the big questions that they're asking when they're looking at opportunities today?
So I could give you a concrete example. I was working with a cement manufacturer, and they were looking at CBAM. And to the large part of this year, they were not looking. They were exporters to Europe, and Europe formed 15% of their market. And about 2% increase in the carbon credit has had a 10% on their bottom line.
Wow.
So no longer are we wandering in the dark. We have created real numbers that's affecting the bottom line of businesses, and especially businesses operating in EU. And it's a matter of time when Asia will catch up, when Africa will catch up. And if you want to remain relevant, and if you want the business to operate, the key risk is stranded assets. So we were looking at about 20% of this cement manufacture, the assets the products that could not be sold.
Wow.
So the question is, in terms of, as companies, do we want to be reactive or proactive? And that's where tools like ICP play a key role.
Zöe, let me bring in you here. We've been talking about some of the opportunities there. On the finance side, what innovation are you seeing in the investment community today to try and bridge some of that $2 trillion gap we were talking about today?
Well, we're seeing different approaches across regions. So in Europe, for example, we've had this tremendous success with the labelled product market, and that has been exported globally. We've also seen a movement to aligning investment thinking around impact and downward emissions curves. And that has led to more of a sort of transition lens thinking than a kind of an opportunity or a risk thinking. This alignment idea that if you want to be fit for purpose for the future, want to preserve against kind of the stranded assets discussion, you want to make sure that your portfolio is resilient, then you kind of have to work out how emissions pathways, how fast they're going to move and how steep they're going to go. And so we've started to see conversations around transition labelled products. Now, that is at the conversation stage, and partly part of that reason is it's difficult to agree on what a transition pathway is going to look like if you're sitting in Asia versus you're sitting in Europe or you're sitting here. And that loops back to the point around your domestic economy and your country climate plan. Because if your domestic economy is based on providing gas, for example, to the world, when the climate solution is electrification of as much as you can, and for power, you haven't scaled up your renewables as much as you possibly can in some locations. You need a kind of bridge, right? And you need to move at your pace. And so I think investors are increasingly pragmatic about how to support this transition. But equally, they are also looking at disclosures as in some places an opportunity and in some places as a kind of bureaucratic hurdle that they don't really need. So the innovative conversation around transition is happening, and to Jessica's point, I was in New York last week and came away completely invigorated by how much activity there was. But there's still a slight fear factor in some places around the integrity element of making sure that you really can demonstrate that your impact of investment is aligned to a net zero world by 2050.
And who is concerned about open disclosure today, if you can answer that?
Yeah. So we run a sentiment survey twice a year to ask investors what they are doing in relation to sustainability and ESG investing and how they're thinking about it. And one of the questions we asked last time round was, do you think regulation is beneficial? And what came back was, in locations where there's quite a long history of both the regulatory backdrop of managing emissions pathways, like in the EU, where way before 2020 there was the 2020 emissions, energy efficiency and renewable energy scale-up legislation. There's a long history there. There, investors were saying, nah, we're not really that keen on the regulation anymore. It's too cumbersome in terms of what we need to disclose. We know how to identify a green project. We know we've got sophisticated tools for measuring impact, so we can do it by ourselves. It's fine. Whereas in other places, like here and in Asia, where investors were maybe slightly earlier on their thinking around impact, they really like the guidelines, they like the legislation, they like a template and a framework that is consistent amongst all of their peers on how they report on these issues.
And I think that's so interesting. Mohamed, let me ask you, when it comes to regulation, we know that beyond packaging, governments in this part of the world are introducing a number of new rules, whether it's carbon reporting, building codes, and waste management as well. But enforcement, it sometimes lags here. Where do you see enforcement weakest today? And what single measure would really improve the playing field? How are we able really to turn waste into a resource instead of a liability?
I love this last statement, waste being a resource and a liability, because it's actually a resource when we use it right. And my simple answer is traceability is the one thing that can really transform waste from being a liability to a resource. Yeah. Because today we don't know what is exactly happening to any waste packaging that we throw in the value chain. Think about the supermarket. If you are in a supermarket and you are buying stuff for your groceries for your home, there's a barcode on each item, right? So we can imagine before barcodes and after barcodes. So if we are able to drive digital traceability on waste types, and I'm here not talking only packaging, I'm talking even municipal waste with the general ones, the construction waste and everything. If we're able to trace waste, this will enable huge difference when it comes to certainty and circular economy. China, when they introduced first their digital traceability system for waste, and they started with a small province and they started to roll out across, they were able to recover more than 30% of the waste that goes to landfill into the actual value chain. So this is on the first one. Specifically on packaging, just to also put things into perspective for everyone, packaging is if we are able to move all of the packaging issues across the globe into circular economy, we will save 1.2 gigatons of carbon dioxide. To put the number into perspective, this is both UK and Japan emissions 100% altogether. So there is a huge opportunity there. And back to your point, it's lots of policies are moving on. The one thing is, how can we drive traceability? Again, back to the same story of the bottle. We start by the consumer awareness, infrastructure for segregation, infrastructure for collection, infrastructure for recycling, mandating the usage of the recycling content, and we drive the right circular economy. About the investors wants to see more on these reporting elements with the companies in the developing economies versus the actual ones. This is exactly a reflection on your question at the beginning, Katie, or the red tapes, which is some of the developed markets on sustainability has lots of red tapes. I fully agree with what you say, Zöe, and this is a great opportunity here in which we are still driving the policies, not to make it micro and focus on a small city or a small country in terms of policies-wise scope versus trying to, as we start the journey and we are driving the momentum, like Jaison said, we want to create it as much as harmonized as we can to drive the scale.
Absolutely. It has to be that mindset change, doesn't it? Jaison and Jessica, let me direct this towards both of you. Again, it's a message we continue to hear. A lot of boards and companies still really treating treating climate rules as a bit of a compliance headache rather than a real financial risk. What would you see as the key thing to get our directors really to see procurement, to see carbon exposure as balance sheet risk? And if they don't do this, where do the biggest problems turn up? Is it lost contracts? Is it investor pressure? Is it even lawsuits? Jaison, I'm going to start with you.
I would say first it would have a direct impact on your P&L.
Yep.
That would be the first thing. Second would be it would be stranded assets. And finally, it would be reputational damage in that order. Right? I would just want to add to echo Mohamed's point as well. I would just want to share a personal story about my foray into sustainability, right? It's all about the narrative. I remember the first time in the Middle East sitting across a CFO and trying to pitch sustainability to them, right? And he kept asking me, are you talking about CSR? I kept saying sustainability, and he kept repeating CSR. And finally, how the project was sold was long-term strategy. So I believe as sustainability professionals, I believe we are in an echo chamber of sorts at the moment. It's about controlling the narrative. How waste, a liability versus waste, a resource. And in terms of, when it comes to policies, regulations, it's about going back to the point that I made earlier on, do we want to be reactive or proactive? And it gives, and tools such as ICP allows companies to have a shadow price on their operations. and recognize before the regulations hit, how do we innovate? How do we improve our processes? I was talking to a client, and we realized the biggest challenge that we had, not just with suppliers, was data on their carbon. And is this carbon verifiable? We had suppliers give out carbon certificates and in terms of the footprint, but it was not verifiable. It's interesting to note less than 20% of the sustainability reports are third-party verified. So there's a huge need for third-party verification amongst organizations. So I would say it's about controlling the narrative, especially when it comes to boards. And here, unlike sustainability or ESG, we are not dealing with fuzzy logic. We're looking at quantifiable numbers, right? So that's lead with numbers. And second is look at regulations and take a stance that's more proactive than reactive. Yeah.
Great advice. Jessica, what do you tell corporates today?
You know, this is such an interesting question because just a few weeks ago, I was in KL training 120 board directors of listed companies there on the S2 disclosures and taking them through a board simulation in which we approved a climate transition plan. And during the tea break, many of them came up to me and was like, why are we doing this? And I said, well, you know, for one thing, you don't want to go to jail because this is a compliance thing that you have to do. You have to look at the S2, you need to be responsible for your disclosures, and you need to articulate what your strategy is for risk management and also whether you're looking at opportunities. But then it's also a defensive and a long-term view, you know, and just adding to what Jaison said, it's really about preparing your organization. And then I posed this question to the room and I said, how many of you, your businesses depend on our natural world? That silence, and I think everyone was just thinking about it. And I was just like, there are no capital markets on a dead planet. Yeah. If you're not thinking about what's happening to our world, on the unprecedented heat that we're seeing, I can't go outside here or in Singapore for too long when the heat is like really boiling because the temperatures are so high. What is that impact on productivity? You know, what is the impact of extreme, you know, weather conditions on water levels and on, you know, the scarcity of our resources and supply of energy and water and food? And I think that a lot of the boards and CEOs that think about this think of it still as pretty much a checkbox exercise. You know, I don't want my regulator on my ass, so I'm going to do this. But actually, you know, if you want to think about how you responsibly steward an organization, these are the questions you need to be asking yourself.
Okay, great advice. We've got a few minutes left. I want to give each of you a minute to answer my final question today. And Zöe, I'm going to start with you. If major economies around the world continue to step back, whether it's the US introducing tariffs and resisting these CBAM-style rules, whether it's UK delaying net zero targets or China doubling down on coal production, what is the one concrete step that this region needs to take to show that the green energy transition cannot be delayed by politics elsewhere?
So it's a very simple one for me. Keep financing it. This region is magnificent at investing overseas in renewables and is magnificent at bringing people together to talk about how to innovate in finance and is magnificent in terms of the sovereign wealth fund potential that is here.
Wise advice. Jessica?
Just one small point on China. They've actually reached peak coal and is actually, you know, leading the world on renewable energy capacity. But I think one concrete step that I'd like to, you know, everyone to take away is really that we need more responsible and beautifully designed legislation. Because if you wait for private sector to take action, they are never going to volunteer to be ahead of the curve. And so what you need is legislation that enables financing, that rewards the right behavior, that enforces rules that punishes bad behavior. And we really need to see good governance and good leadership from our elected leaders.
Absolutely. The right incentives are key as well as the punishments in regulation as well. Great point. Jaison, what are your thoughts?
I would want to echo Zoe's point in terms of there's a need for pragmatic policies. Yeah. That's one. And to echo the point on sovereign wealth fund, just to give scale, the green economy currently is valued at 7.9 trillion US dollars. And the capacity of the sovereign wealth fund from GCC alone is 3.9. So they can act as extended arms. So I would strongly encourage, which is already being done, to integrate sustainability into your core strategy. That would be for the private sector. For the public sector, I would say we need pragmatic policies that act as guardrails and increase the number of bankable projects. That would be my advice for the region, which is already being followed. It's not really much of an advice, but for the wider region, yes. Absolutely
incredible figures there you mentioned too. Mohamed, final thoughts with you today.
Policies, again, so all I believe the whole panel was focusing on how to harmonize policies, but for me it's policies that are not, because you mentioned the global thing. You said a very strong word, which is we don't need Washington, we don't need Brussels. I believe we need them as partners, but we don't need them as we being followers in terms of the global south. So policies that are created for this region, by this region, that are in nature, not facing any, cannot be, I would say, by any political instability, be changed. And this will only be there if there is a commercial sense in it. And I loved your example about 2% increase in carbon emissions, 10% hurt, or a 15% hurt on the bottom line, this is the correlation that we can create as we go. And my last point on Jessica, private sector will not volunteer to create a scale as policy to drive circularity. They might maybe volunteer a bit here, a bit there to drive CSR, but not actually circularity.
Absolutely, all makes a big impact, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining us today. Incredible discussion this afternoon. Please join with me in thanking our speakers.